Hey everyone, welcome back. Today we're going to take a look at the visual art of Romanticism as an era of emotion, imagination, and narrative. And I wanted to take a look at some of the main differences that we're going to see between Romanticism and the art of the Enlightenment or art of the Baroque era. And I wanted to turn to Gotthold Lessing, who is a German writer and philosopher, and he really does help to establish or at least vocalize a lot of the changes that are happening during the Romantic era. And here's what he says. He says, the artist should subordinate nature to his general purpose and not pursue it further than truth and expression allow. And so what he's suggesting here is that Romanticism is going to be very different from that of the Renaissance. The Renaissance was focusing on trying to replicate nature, to see how the eye, or to understand how the eye sees, and to be able to reproduce that within painting and sculpture. What we see with Romanticism is that, as Lessing suggesting that the visual reality should not triumph over expression, right? The expression needs to be more important than actual reality. And so we see a separation kind of for the first movement. We're going to see this continue on with modernism, but this kind of first movement away from, we don't necessarily need to be shackled by visual reality. We need to be focused more on expression, the artist's expression. He says, continuing on, enough that truth and expression convert what is unsightly in nature into a beauty in art. And so this is kind of like taking your cell phones out, and you take the camera and you hit the filter lens, right? You want to make something seem a little bit brighter or seem a little bit more intense in its differentiation between colors. He says, beauty is nature idealized with expression of the artist, not imprisoned by nature, but every touch or every combination of touches by means of which the poet brings his subject so vividly before us is picturesque and makes what we call a picture. And so it mainly should be about expression, about emotion, about telling a story, and it shouldn't necessarily be shackled by reality. And so some of the major elements that we're going to see with Romanticism, whether it's art or whether it's literature or music, we see on the left-hand side here, mainly these are the elements that unite this era kind of loosely together. A transference of emotion, that means trying to get what the artist or the writer is feeling and be able to convey that within the reader or the viewer. Self-expression, they believe that art should be about self-expression, about the ability to tell the emotional quality, to focus on the feelings of the artist over what something actually looks like. It's going to be about individualism, right? The individual insights that the artist has is going to be center stage. It's going to focus more on the imagination and the irrational elements, things that are beyond human reason. The irrational side would be kind of like the supernatural, the demons, goblins, things that are beyond the five senses. It's about feeling over thought, where the Enlightenment was all about the senses, empirical reasoning, about how we can study nature and be able to control it to a certain extent. Romanticism says that that's not really what we want to do. We don't really want to focus on that. We want to focus on things that are beyond the senses, right? What's kind of that supernatural element, or focusing on imagination rather than telling the exact story, trying to elaborate or emphasize some, dramatize that story to a little bit more, to make it more interesting. And so we see more dramatic elements being represented, more intense images to get to that emotional side. And you're going to see, in order to get to that dramatic elements, more of the tragedy versus happiness, these kind of extreme hardship and suffering, or extreme happiness and joy. We're going to see these dynamic elements being represented. Within painting, some of the techniques that you're going to see is more of the looser brushstroke, more to get that expressive side of what the artist is trying to convey, more intensity of colors, right, to create that contrast. We're going to see more complex and asymmetrical compositions, meaning rather than the Raphael's, the School of Athens, where there's the same amount of people on either side, or Da Vinci's The Last Supper, where there's 6 apostles on one side and 6 apostles on the other. We're going to see more of an asymmetrical composition, meaning there's going to be more crammed to one side than the other, in order to create more intensity. We'll talk a little bit more about that. More expressive shading is going to be similar to a lot of what we've seen with Baroque. More expressive gestures, more emotion being represented within it. This is a kind of a good work to think about as we think about some of the transitions to Romanticism, because this one's kind of a transitionary piece. It's not quite Romanticism 100%, and it's not quite the Enlightenment 100%. It's kind of somewhere in between. But what we see here with an experiment on a bird in an air pump is that you have this air pump here, and then he puts this scientist here who kind of reminds me of the mad scientist from Back to the Future. If you've ever seen that, it kind of has that kind of, I don't know, expressive hair, and he's kind of wearing this kind of robe just to show this kind of dramatic element to it. And then as they put the bird inside this little bowl here, they're going to pump all of the oxygen out, and then the bird, due to the lack of oxygen, is going to faint, right, pass out, and then he's going to reintroduce the oxygen into the bowl, and then the bird is going to magically come back to life, right? And then this young fellow over here on the right-hand side is his assistant, who is getting ready to open the cage, and then the bird's going to get up and fly into the cage. And so, in some ways, this is values of the Enlightenment, right? This is about studying nature, about humanity's ability to study the natural world, to be able to control it. And here we see he's taking out the oxygen and going to reintroduce it. But in some ways, it's different from that, because this is a stage scene, right? This almost feels like they're on stage and we're in the audience kind of looking at these events as though this individual here is less of a scientist and more of an actor, right? And he invites these individuals here to kind of study this and to kind of come in and look on. And then we have this kind of couple here. I guess this is date night or something, where they're going to see the scientist and see how we can understand nature. And then you have this loving father who kind of puts his arms around and consoles his daughters here who are worried about the dead bird. And the father kind of points to him as kind of this way of saying, no, wait, there's more here to it. But what we see is that this is a dramatic element. And so what we're going to see with romantic visual art is it's going to focus more on the climax of the story, much like what we see with the Baroque era, right? So we see a lot of elements, a lot of commonalities between the Romantic art and that of Baroque, right? We see the dramatic lighting, the intense lighting that makes it more kind of this kind of feeling of intensity, where we see this kind of interesting light source down here which kind of shines on their faces just to show their more expressive qualities, similar to what we saw with Caravaggio, with the very strategically lit body of Christ with the spear wound in the side, and Thomas kind of taking that close peek. So similar to that particular element, but it also has some elements of the Enlightenment, right? These ideas of our ability to devote ourselves to a cause greater than ourselves, right? And so and what I wanted to demonstrate with Joseph Wright's experiment on a bird in an air pump is that it's not as though society changes overnight, and it's not as though the ideas start to emerge and all of a sudden no one else paints the old style, right? That artists are kind of doing individual things, and they're responding to social, historical events, but they're also kind of, it doesn't necessarily change on a dime. And so we see some subtle transitionary pieces as we move forward. And so this is a good one to kind of think about. This one's a little bit early than what I would consider the actual Romantic era beginning. I would say that Romanticism begins with the French Revolution in 1789, or maybe even with the Reign of Terror in 1792. So this one's a little bit early in that, but it's kind of a precursor of some of the things that are going to be coming down the pike. We've taken a look at this one before, The Death of Marat. I have argued that this is in some ways part of neoclassicism, and I want to argue also in some ways that this is part of Romanticism as well. Again, that's kind of transitionary piece. Here we see Jean-Paul Marat, who's the leader of the Jacobin Party and a radical journalist. We talked about how he had a rare skin condition, and so he took these long medicinal baths. And so Here we see that this is a kind of a political commentary on by David on Marat, and this kind of extreme individual who's promoting more and more deaths. We see that David is suggesting that there is something worth dying for. And so this isn't necessarily exactly how the death actually occurred. There's some similarities to how the death occurred, but it's not about as though David is suggesting that we need to be shackled by reality. We need to be able to focus more on the expressive components. And here the expression is this kind of release, this kind of smile on his face that he died fighting for what he believed in. It. There are ideals bigger than us. Just to kind of continue on with our theme of David, I wanted to leave off our discussion with Napoleon crossing the Saint Bernard with a golden cloak. He did about 5 different variations of this particular one. Here's the first version at Versailles and the second version at Versailles, just to give you the sense of kind of this is a work in progress for him, something he kind of came back to trying to get right. I wanted to kind of focus more on this one. This one's probably the more common one that people refer to. But David was initially the court painter for Louis XVI, and he was painting a lot of images about how we need to focus on ideals and be willing to die for causes, right? We see that with Marat. We also see that with the Oath of Herédy. But what happens with that is as he becomes that court painter, he unwittingly or unintentionally helps to bring about the French Revolution, right? People start to see his ideals about things that are worth dying for, things that are bigger, causes that we need to believe in. And so in some ways he becomes this inspirational figure that brings people together and unites them to fight for the rights of the people. And then as he's kind of now without, a patron, as Napoleon comes to power, Napoleon sees his talent and says, hey, do you want to, be my painter as well? And so he takes that opportunity and he does these images. And in a way, these become propagandistic, right? These are a way to promote the greatness of Napoleon. In this particular scene, right, what's being represented here is that this is the moment when Napoleon crosses the Alps and invades Italy. This is something that didn't really happen a whole lot because the Alps are so large and very intense to cross, and you get a lot of extreme weather, that it doesn't really happen a whole lot. And so here you have at the very bottom Hannibal, which was, I think he was a 4th century general that crossed the Alps to conquer parts of Italy. And then you have Charlemagne down here, who's written in stone, who is another successful general that went on to conquer. And then you have next to that, you have Napoleon Bonaparte etched in to show that his kind of legacy, he's as good as Hannibal, he's as good as Charlemagne. He's this successful general, and he's going off to reclaim part of Italy. And it's kind of interesting the way that he does represent this. I mean, because in a way, this is not at all realistic. Napoleon did cross the Alps and he did conquer parts of Italy, but he did so on a donkey, and so he didn't necessarily do it on this white, majestic steed. And so David's taken liberties with those realistic components. As Lessing says, you don't necessarily need to be shackled or imprisoned by reality. We need to be expressive, and so he's trying to capture the actual sense of the emotional quality of it rather than the reality of it. And we see some of that intensity of of nature kind of circling around. It seems as though there's a storm coming. There's the wind blowing, and we see the mane and the tail of the horse and the cloak of Napoleon, and then he's commanding his troops forward in a motion that follows the wind. And so in some ways it almost suggests that Napoleon has the power to even command the wind. And so it's focusing more on, in some ways these kind of images are very neoclassical because they do have that political bite to them. But again, they're showing that transition towards Romanticism by taking more artistic liberties with them. Let's take a look at Goya and the sleep of reason produces monsters, and some ideas that we see within this particular work. is that Goya was extremely concerned about Spain because Spain's very traditional. At least it was very traditional to a certain extent. It's still very traditional to this day. But they didn't necessarily embrace the Romantic ideals. They were kind of slow to the Enlightenment. And so he wanted to represent some of the problems if you just ignore reason. And so here you have this student who's at the desk, and then in Spanish it says the sleep of reason produces monsters. And so at night all of these kind of monsters awaken and come to wreak havoc on humanity. And so some of the elements that he's suggesting here is that we need reason in order to better our particular society. But again, I mean, in some ways, this is still kind of Enlightenment, neoclassical kind of vein, right? Where he's suggesting that we need reason, which is Romanticism is kind of anti-reason in a lot of ways. And it does have that political message concerned with the Enlightenment, how Spain needs to modernize. But we also see here that, this other concern is that politics leads to things like the Inquisition, which Spain is continually struggling with, right? He's suggesting here that there's this element of imagination that he's almost, in some ways, he's criticizing, but in some ways he's kind of celebrating. These kind of monsters come out at night. I wanted to take a look at one of his more famous paintings. This is the 3rd of May. What we see within this particular one is in 1808, Napoleon invades Spain and conquers it. And at first, people rejoice. They kind of see Napoleon as this liberator from their oppressive king who's rooted in the past. And so this to them is kind of like their version of the French Revolution, right? Trying to get away from their, version of Louis XVI, or the Spanish king. Or who they're having as their Spanish king. But what happens is in May, rumors start to spread that France will kill the royal family, right? And the idea for this is kind of a Machiavellian idea. Is when you invade a country, you need to get rid of the leader, right? The past leader, because if they're overshadowing, eventually people are going to say, well, wait, maybe things were better back then. And so you need to eliminate the old leadership. But what happens with this, right? Even though the Spanish people were not happy with their king, they did see him as a symbol of their pride, a symbol of their tradition. And so they weren't necessarily happy with a foreign entity coming in and killing their kind of symbol of their national pride. And so a mob ensued to protest Napoleon putting to death the King of Spain. And what happened is the French army comes in, they gather up all the people, and they execute them on May the 3rd. And so here on the right-hand side, you see Napoleon's army coming in, clothed in kind of these drab, blue, gray, black kind of clothing, which kind of emotionless, cold, kind of mechanical. This is what happens when we focus on, politics over emotion or over individuality. Versus individuality on this side with the emotion, the light. And here we have this light that's cast onto these individuals as they're being executed. In order to add to that drama, we see the hill here that's foreshortening the background and kind of pressing them up against it to make it seems that there is no escape here. We have this individual who has expressive gestures, who has his hands up, which is almost in a Christ-like way, and almost in a crucifixion. His white clothes here demonstrate his innocence. He's unarmed, and yet he's going to be put to death by Napoleon's army. And we have the yellow pants here to demonstrate the energy, the life that's going to be snuffed out. And then the red, the blood here that's being spilt, the life that's being drained out of these individuals. And so, in a way, this has that romantic kind of, this is Goya kind of transitioning to more of these romantic ideas, that politics, that reason leads to things like this, right? It leads to mechanical executions of entire groups of people. And so here we see this is a cautionary tale of what happens when we focus too much on reason and don't have enough of emotion. William Blake was an English poet and also a printmaker. And so we're going to take a look at some of his poems, but also take a look at one of his images that he creates. This is Elohim creating Adam. And what we see within this particular one is kind of some interesting expressive colors. We see the contrast of grays and blues and blacks to make it more intense and conflicting, contrasted with the yellows, the reds, and the orange to make it more kind of energetic. The kind of gray and black clouds here kind of feel ominous and kind of intense. And then the asymmetrical composition, right? This kind of forces more towards the right-hand side than to the left-hand side. But what we see here, this is kind of the subject matter here, the content, what's going to be, what's being represented is this is the fall of humanity. This is the fall of Adam. And so kind of interesting that this is the creation of Adam, right? This is God creating Adam. But already he has this serpent around his neck, around his waist, just waiting to pull him down, to pull away reason. Getting back to the story of Adam and Eve, what separates God from humanity is reason, right? The tree of knowledge is the moment that we decided to take and act away from God and to act for ourselves. And this is what separates us. And this is the downfall, right? That human reason is what causes us to lose our spirituality, to lose our innocence, and to become unlike God. And so to compare and contrast, right, the Renaissance version of this moment of creation versus the romantic representation of this, we see some very different mindsets emerging, very different ideas that represent each era, right? Michelangelo, what we see is he depicts the elevating qualities of humanity. He argues that we are created in the image of God, and so therefore we're destined to become like him. We have inherent, immortal, eternal qualities such as the freedom to choose, right? This idea of enlightenment, our idea of intellect, or a drive towards this spiritual realm to elevate us from this physical world that we live in. And we have this desire to reach out to the eternal realm. And the eternal realm, this God figure, reaches back, right? And so it's kind of this connection between man and God. We see a different kind of image with Blake's Elohim creating Adam, right? It's less optimistic. God violently pushes humanity's head down, or Adam's head down here. Humanity here has the look on his face of melancholy, of sadness, right? Creation for romantics is negative. We have fallen out of our innocence, and we need to reconnect with the divine, and this is going to be done, as we're going to see, through the arts, through poetry, and through nature. And so some kind of interesting, as we think about these two works, kind of interesting different representations of the same moment that demonstrate some of the major changes that have happened in the last couple of centuries to change the way that we see ourselves. Let's take a look at a couple of political images, and just to show you that, I mean, there is some political ideals with romantic art and literature, but it's done quite differently. What we see with Delacroix's Lady Liberty leading the people is that what happens kind of to pick up on our story of the French Revolution. In 1815, Napoleon is ousted. So we talk about Napoleon's rise to power. Now in 1815, he's ousted. And so what happens is France decides that Louis XVIII, who is the brother of Louis XVI, should replace Napoleon as their new leader. So they kind of go back to this old form of, hey, maybe things were better before. And so they kind of go back to this old, let's take a look at the old monarchy and say if we can bring them back in, maybe we can have a little bit more stability, because Napoleon, who was a commoner, right, he rose to power and it didn't work out well. And so maybe we kind of need to go back to find a little bit more stability in our past. The people gave Louis XVIII strict limitations. He had to obey a constitution. He had to share power with a representative body of government. But when he died in 1824, his brother Charles X became king. And as Charles X comes into power, he reinstates censorship and gives more power to Catholics. So again, we don't have that separation of church and state, which becomes a problem for the French people. He limits the civil liberties and their voting rights, and as a result, a massive uprising occurred in July 1830, which is what is being represented here, right? This revolution or this rebellion that happened was largely made by students. And for those of you that are Les Mis fans, this is the setting for the last section, and this is the backdrop for Marius's and Cosette's relationship. And so just to give you some of that kind of context here, what we see here is a little bit more looser brushstroke, more expressive brushstroke. We see the strong, intense colors, right? We see how the smoke kind of foreshortens the background, kind of focusing our attention on actually Lady Liberty, who wields a musket in one hand and a flag in the other, and unfortunately is having a wardrobe malfunction. But as we take a look towards the back, right, the closer we get to the back, the more kind of ambiguous the figures actually become, and so they become much more expressive. We see that kind of asymmetrical composition where it feels as though there's more going on one side of the canvas here on the left-hand side than on the right-hand side. And we see much more expressive gestures, people kind of gathering up their swords and their guns, and they're marching forward to take back power, right, to fight against the oppressive state. We see that this is mainly focusing on trying to inspire the viewer, and it's mainly about imagination, right? So it's not as though there was actually a Lady Liberty out there fighting, with a gun in one hand and a flag in the other. She's more of a symbolic figure, and so it's not as though Delacroix out there trying to paint exactly how he sees. He's trying to capture the essence of it, of people coming from all walks of life, whether they're merchants coming from kind of the upper middle class, or the poor, or the young, right? This is kind of demonstrating this unity of everyone coming together to fight for a common ideal, right? This idea of fighting for something that's bigger than yourself. And in some ways that sounds very similar to neoclassicism, but the way that he represents this, right? The way that he's creating this kind of this imaginative element makes it more of that romantic kind of expressive kind of feeling that we see. I want to take a look at one more. This is just me standing next to it, just to give you a sense of the size. This one is in the Louvre, and most of these works of art that we're going to take a look at today are actually in one room in the Louvre. It's kind of interesting that they kind of put them all together, which is great. They just have this. You have this very romantic, kind of expressive, dynamic experience as you go through that room in the Louvre. Let's take a look at the scenes of the massacre at Chios. In 1822, the Greeks, like the Americans earlier, were struggling for independence from Turkey. The Turks stopped momentarily at Chios, which is this kind of small island, and enact revenge against the Greeks on the people on the island. And they killed about 20,000 of the 100,000 inhabitants. And just to give you a sense of context, right? That's about the size of Rexburg. That 20,000 people were killed of 100,000. So the island itself had a population of 100,000. So they killed about 1/5 of the people. So what we see here is that the emphasis on the suffering of the people after being devastated by this event. They left broken. They left the people that were alive were broken and weary. There was a sense of hopelessness, right? And we see that sense of hopelessness in their eyes. That the Turks here are handsomely decorated and on the kind of victorious horses as they come in to kind of enact their revenge on the Greeks, and the Greeks here kind of downtrodden, kind of having this look of kind of this mystified look on their face, and trying to kind of as though they're trying to figure out what's going on, or kind of looking up to God to say, what's happening? Why are you allowing this to happen? And so this is the moment of extreme destruction. Something that we see with Romanticism is the focus on this loss of life. But we also see the kind of expressive brushstrokes that we see common to the Romantic era. We see the asymmetrical composition where more is happening on the left-hand side. That gives it a sense of that something is off balance. So we see some of those elements that are common to Romanticism. Well, this one's also in the same room. This is me just kind of walking down a couple more. Just give you a sense of size. These are all extremely large. Just to kind of think about these in connection with one another, I want you to think about The themes, right? Not only just the stylistic elements of the colors and the shading, but also the thematic elements of what do we see being emphasized. What are some problems that we see that Romanticism is illustrating within these two works, right? What are the problems that we see with reason? What are the problems that we see with government? Even though the Enlightenment says that we're going to find a government that's going to promote the most amount of happiness for the most amount of people, what we see with that application kind of a couple decades later is that that doesn't necessarily work, right? There's some problems with corruption. There's problems with human fallibility. There's problems with folly, right? That human reason doesn't necessarily lead humanity to this greater end, this greater ideal of less suffering. It actually can increase human suffering. Let's take a look at Ingres's The Large Odalisque. And an odalisque is a reference to a harem. So this is kind of a French individual's, a Western's interpretation of what a Eastern harem would look like. And interestingly enough, Napoleon's sister commissioned this to be done before they were thrown from power. So this is 1814, and Napoleon's taken from power 1 year later. But this is one of the major pieces of Romanticism because it kind of points to some of the major elements that we see within Romantic visual arts. What we see here is that this is more expressive. It's unnatural. Her back is way too long for her body, right? As well as her arms, right? So we kind of see this long kind of back here. There's too many vertebrae to be realistic. We see her arms here as it seems as though she could scratch her knees without bending over. Her feet are too small for her body. Her head is too small for her body. And so it's not necessarily about being anatomically correct. It's about creating an image to evoke an emotion, right? And so this, initially, in the past, this would be considered ugly because it's not precise in the way it's representing the human body. But it's not necessarily about that, right? It's not about representing, exact proportions. It's about emphasizing the most alluring portions. And so this is kind of this sensual kind of look that she has as she kind of turns back and engages the viewer. And it's not as though she's, angry, or it's not as though she's kind of flirtatious. It's almost as though she's kind of looking back matter of fact. And so we see some major differences, some changes from the Renaissance art, but we also see some changes that we see with the Baroque art, right? With the Baroque art, what we see with Rembrandt is more the focus, and we see more of that focus on the anatomy, but a different kind of representation of womanhood as well, right? With Rembrandt, he's more focusing on the effects of what her image, what her beauty is actually bringing to pass. We don't necessarily see that within this particular image here. We see that she's kind of aware that people are looking at her. She's kind of indifferent to it, which we don't necessarily see here. We see kind of more of that dramatic element to this. And a different element that we see with Rococo, right? A different kind of representation of womanhood, different representation of love that's being represented more kind of playful. This one is not necessarily playful, right? It's not necessarily focusing on the kind of gritty, problematic kind of complexities either, but it's not necessarily playful. It's kind of somewhere in between for us to consider. And this is kind of me. I don't know what I'm thinking when in that phase. But again, it's in the same room, kind of giving you a sense of the context of going to the Louvre. Hopefully, one day you'll make it to Paris and walk through the Louvre. Jericho, let's take a look at the Raft of Medusa. Just have a couple more images that I wanted to go through, just to give you a sense of what's happening within the Enlightenment, or what's happening within Romanticism and their art. In 1816, a ship with over 400 passengers set sail for Senegal, which is in northwest Africa. It ran aground, and so it was kind of they hit a particularly shallow point as they were sailing, and the ship was stuck. And what happened was that the captain decided to engineer a another boat, right, in order to try to find help. And then they created this kind of makeshift raft. And as they were kind of moving forward, right, as they were leaving this boat, trying to find help and safety, the captain realized that this raft that they made was holding this kind of makeshift other vessel that they built, that they constructed, back. And so they cut the ties with the raft and left 152 people stranded in the middle of the ocean. And so what we see here is kind of some of the problems with political institutions, right? We see that the leader, one of the representatives of the French Navy, is abandoning people, focusing solely on his own kind of personal endeavors. And what happens when we don't really focus on individuals, that individuals get left behind. And so these individuals were out at sea for 13 days. And only 15 of the 152 passengers were alive, and it was a gruesome tale that made national news. People had to resort to cannibalism in order to survive, and so Géricault depicts the moment when these passengers first spot the rescue ship, and so way off in the distance here, you see the rescue ship that's kind of on the horizons, and these individuals are trying to flag it down. Notice the twisting and contorted human bodies as they become one in striving to survive. And this individual here is kind of pushing himself up as he kind of moves away from, almost on the verge of death, but hears that there's hope on the horizon. He's kind of moving towards that sense of hope. But this is about the triumph of the human spirit. And it's also partially about the agony of human suffering, because on the left-hand side, we see this father here holding the corpse of his dead son. We see this half-eaten, rotting corpse that's just kind of deteriorating out in the sun due to exposure. And this other body here is just kind of lifeless. And so you see the extreme amount of human suffering, the loss of life. Even though there's moments of extreme joy, there's also going to be moments of extreme suffering. And Géricault was very intrigued by this particular story. He took like a year or so to try to find the right composition in order to find the right kind of way to express this. He actually interviewed survivors. He went to the morgue, and he wanted to find the body parts in order to get the body parts exactly right, and in order to represent, to pay tribute to the intensity. Right, it's not just about trying to glaze over to say that this is kind of a political message, to say, hey, they were saved by this ship, but it's also not necessarily to say that this is all about human suffering either. So he's trying to demonstrate that complexity, to try to find a nice balance between them, as the figures border between death and salvation, is partly what he's representing. Another image, again, as I'm showing you here, a lot of these images are coming from the same room in the Louvre. Let's take a look at one more Géricault image. This is Pity the Sorrows of a Poor Old Man, and this is a print that he made. And I just wanted to demonstrate some of the kind of the elements that are common to Romanticism. Here we see the emphasis on human suffering. This is this is focusing on individualized suffering, and shows some of the problems that we can ignore. Right, if we just focus on what's best for the most amount of people, we're going to lose sight of those that are most vulnerable. All right, so we're going to sometimes neglect the poor. The old man here sits outside a bakery where people conduct themselves as usual without concern for their welfare. And so here's the bakery, and this bread is just right here, right within his grasp, but nobody pays attention to him. And so it's not as though he's overtly condemning the oblivious baker. He's not necessarily pointing a finger at them, but what he's suggesting is that society can become oblivious to human suffering. They might not be malicious in doing so. There might not necessarily be any malintent, but we can inadvertently wrong others if we're only focusing on the most amount of human happiness, right? So we need to be able to focus on individual human suffering within that. And so this is kind of a commentary against universals and against focusing the Enlightenment's focus on trying to find the most amount of happiness for everyone. Let's kind of leave off with two images here. One is by Caspar David Friedrich in his Nebel or Fog. We see a radical shift in the view of nature during Romanticism. Nature is not to be studied or controlled. That actually leads to problems, right? Nature can actually come back and react against us. And so all of these efforts that we have to control nature, once in a while, nature will come back and humble these efforts. That nature is an entity unto itself. It has a life of its own that cannot be controlled. Here we see nature is observed for its greatness and its immensity. These are mainly coming from his memories. So it's not as though he's out there with a canvas painting exactly what he sees. He's just kind of recollecting, right, his experiences, his emotional, his encounters with nature. But here, the interesting element here is the fog, right? That the fog has kind of this, it's almost as though it's a character, right? This kind of anti-hero within the story. And nature here reveals part to us. We can kind of see the smaller boat coming to shore, see the kind of somewhat of a larger boat here, just kind of off in the distance. It reveals some things to us, but there's a lot of mystery of nature, right? It has some hidden powers that it conceals from us. And so that's a romantic way of viewing nature. Or Joseph Mallard William Turner's Snowstorm Hannibal and his army crossing the Alps. And so again, here we see the immense power of nature. And so here we see again crossing the Alps, but the snowstorm here is coming in to overshadow the soldiers on their kind of vain attempts to try to defeat the nature. And just to compare this one between David's Napoleon crossing the Alps and Turner's Hannibal crossing the Alps, we see a very different kind of this transition between how nature is represented. David's image here is kind of early Romanticism, or kind of more, has some elements of neoclassicism embedded within it. Turner's here is immersed fully within Romanticism. And so we see that full change of the embrace, the complete embrace of nature. Here we see Napoleon almost commanding, directing the wind. Here we see that nature has some elements to it that overshadow us, that make us feel futile, make us feel really small, make us feel powerless, and that can completely undermine any attempts that we have to try to control it. So these are some of the main themes, right? So it's not as though Romanticism is kind of in some ways all over the place. It encompasses about 150 years or so. And so you have a different artists kind of interacting with these different ideas and trying to come up with their own understanding, their own commentary, their own discussion on these ideas. And so it's kind of complex as we take a look at some of these elements. It's not as though there's a kind of a necessarily universal style. All we see are some general kind of broad sketches of thematic and artistic insights that we see.